Margaret Dolan stood in the rain outside the house she had scrubbed, polished, and paid for with 41 years of her own quiet labor, holding a single crumpled dollar bill and a rusted iron key, while her late husband's truck, driven now by his son, pulled out of the driveway for the last time. She was 66 years old. She had raised 2 boys who never once called her mother, kept the books for a hardware store that never carried her name, and buried a husband she had loved without condition 3 months earlier. And in exchange for 4 decades of devotion, his sons had handed her $1 and a key so rusted she could barely turn it in her fingers, calling it, with a straight face, her full inheritance. But that key was not a joke, and it was not nothing. Frank Dolan had never done anything without a reason, not once in 41 years, and the men who tossed that key at Maggie like a coin to a beggar had no idea what quiet, patient hands had built while they weren't watching. Somewhere down the coast, behind a padlock nobody had touched in decades, something was waiting for her, something worth more than every account they had already drained and every room they had already claimed. If you have ever been handed scraps by people who owed you everything, if you have ever been counted out by the very family you gave your life to, this story was written for you. Subscribe now, because what that rusted key unlocked would prove, beyond any doubt, that 4 decades of quiet devotion are never as invisible as greedy men believe. Before this story ends, the sons who mocked her with a single dollar bill would learn exactly what $12 million felt like slipping through their fingers. Maggie did not know it yet, standing soaked to the bone in that driveway, but she was about to walk toward the one single door in the world those men could never open, and the day she turned that key would be the last day anyone in her family ever underestimated her again. Maggie Dolan married Frank Dolan on a warm afternoon in the summer of 1985, in a small ceremony at St. Anne's Church in Saltmarsh Cove, Maine, with folding chairs borrowed from the fellowship hall, a second-hand veil pinned by her sister at the last minute, and a 3-layer cake his mother baked herself because there was no money left over for a proper bakery order that year. She was 25, bright-eyed and hopeful in a dress she had altered twice herself, and he was 34, a widower's kind of tired, already settled permanently into his shoulders, with 2 young sons from a marriage that had ended in grief rather than scandal, Denny, barely 7 years old, and Kurt, only 4, both of them clutching fistfuls of her skirt at the reception like she was the only steady thing left in the room. Nobody ever sat Maggie down and formally asked her to raise those boys as her own child. She simply did it, the way water finds the low ground without being told, packing their school lunches for 13 straight years, sitting through every school play in a hard-folding auditorium chair, nursing their childhood fevers at 2 in the morning with a cool washcloth pressed to small foreheads. In all that time, across birthdays and Christmases, and 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays, neither boy ever once called her mother, not by accident, not even when they were frightened and small. She told herself, again and again, that it did not matter, that love did not require a title to be real, and by the time she reached her 60s, she had almost convinced herself completely. For 35 of those years, Maggie worked the counter at Dolan's Hardware on Main Street, ringing up nails and paint cans and coils of garden hose from 6 in the morning until closing time, 6 days a week, wearing a green canvas apron with Dolan stitched across the chest in white thread she had sewn on herself late one night when the old one finally wore through. Frank called it a family business, always with a warm hand on her shoulder, and she believed him completely. So she kept every ledger in her own careful, looping handwriting, balanced the cash register down to the last penny each night before locking the door, restocked the shelves after closing when her feet had already gone numb inside her shoes, and never once, not in 35 years, drew a single paycheck with her own name printed at the top. At Sunday supper, in that same kitchen for 4 decades running, she was always the last to sit down at the table, and the last to take a single bite, filling every plate in front of her before she ever touched her own fork. A small and entirely private ritual of sacrifice that none of them ever seemed to notice. Least of all the two grown men who reached for the food first, left the table first, and never once, in all those years, carried their own dishes to the sink. Frank Dolan was never a demonstrative man, never one for flowers or speeches, but he was steady, and for 4 decades steady had been more than enough to build a life around for Maggie. He fixed whatever broke around the house without ever being asked twice. He showed up in every hospital waiting room and stood through every funeral that mattered to their small corner of the county, and every single Tuesday, without a single exception across 30 years, he climbed alone into his old Ford truck and drove 40 minutes down the coastal road to a town called Saltmarsh Harbor. "Just business, Maggie," he always said, folding his jacket carefully over one arm before he left. "Nothing at all for you to worry about." And she never once pressed him for more, because pressing was not her way, and because she trusted him the way she trusted the tide to rise and fall twice a day without ever needing to be reminded. He came home from those drives smelling of cold salt water and diesel fuel, and something else underneath both of those smells that she could never quite name. Some rusted, mineral scent that clung stubbornly to his collar until she scrubbed it out by hand in the laundry sink. And he, never once, in 3 decades, brought home a single word about what or who waited for him at the other end of that road. Denny grew into a man who wore his father's name like a coupon. He never once stopped cashing, 32 years old before he held down any job longer than 8 consecutive months, 42 years old by the time this story catches up with him, and never once, in all that time, thanking the woman who had ironed his shirts for job interviews, he skipped and co-signed loans. He quietly let lapse into collections while she covered the difference without a word of complaint. Kurt was quieter, but noticeably colder, 39 years old, the kind of man who scanned every room he entered and calculated precisely how much warmth it was worth spending before he spent a single ounce of it. Both of the boys, now grown men with mortgages and grievances of their own, treated Maggie the way people treat furniture that simply came bundled with the house when they inherited it, useful enough, unremarkable, easy to leave behind on the curb when moving day finally came. She absorbed every bit of it the way she absorbed everything else that passed through that kitchen, with a tired smile and a fresh pot of coffee already brewing on the stove, telling herself again that family meant patience above all else, that real love kept no ledger of its own, even while she kept every single other ledger in that house, down to the last recorded cent. The numbers of her devotion were never abstract to Maggie, even though nobody else in that family ever bothered to write a single one of them down. 41 years of marriage to a man she had loved without condition. 35 years spent behind that hardware counter, opening at 6, closing the register herself most nights. $0 ever paid to her in wages under her own name. Not one check, not one deposit slip. 2 stepsons raised up from the tender ages of 7 and 4 into grown men who, decades later, still called her nothing warmer than Maggie, if they bothered to call her anything at all when they wanted something from her, a loan, a signature, a favor smoothed over. She had given away everything measurable inside that house, her time, her labor, her Sunday mornings, her own name on nothing, her own comfort set quietly aside for later, and asked for almost nothing at all in return. For a long, long stretch of years, that lopsided arrangement had felt, if never entirely fair, at least survivable, because Frank was always there right beside her, steady and warm, quietly filling in every cold silence the boys left scattered behind them at that table, year after year, decade after decade, until the arrangement itself became the only shape she knew how to call a marriage. Then Frank died on a gray, unremarkable Tuesday morning in March, quietly, in his sleep, the exact way steady men so often seem to go, and Maggie was left standing alone in a house crowded wall to wall with 41 years of memory, while her two stepsons had already begun measuring the furniture before the funeral flowers even had time to wilt on the porch railing. She told herself, in those first raw weeks, that grief alone was sharpening her nerves against nothing more than ordinary family friction, nothing worth losing sleep over at her age, nothing a strong cup of coffee and a quiet morning couldn't settle. But some nights, lying wide awake in the same bed they had shared since 1985, listening to the house creak the way old houses do, her mind kept circling back, again and again, to those unexplained Tuesday drives, to the smell of salt and rust that never fully washed out of his collar no matter how hard she scrubbed, to the small, careful way he had once told her, near the very end, sitting on the edge of that same bed. "Whatever happens to me, Maggie, you will be taken care of," and she could not, for the life of her, understand exactly what her husband of 41 years had truly meant by those quiet, unfinished words that now would not leave her alone. The will reading took place on a Thursday morning in the cramped office of Walter Briggs, the family attorney who had handled Frank's paperwork for 20 years, 3 weeks after the funeral, in a room that smelled of old carpet, stale coffee, and the particular hush of documents about to change someone's whole life, for better or for worse, depending entirely on which side of the table you happened to be sitting. Denny Dolan sat with his phone in his lap the entire time, thumb scrolling without pause through something that made him smirk twice, while the attorney read through Frank's assets line by line in a flat, practiced voice that gave nothing away. Kurt sat beside him, arms crossed tight across his chest, jaw set, checking his watch not once, but twice, before the papers were even halfway read, sighing loudly enough that Walter Briggs paused mid-sentence. Maggie sat alone on the opposite side of the table, hands folded in her lap, the exact posture she had held through 41 years of church pews and hospital waiting rooms, wearing the same navy blue cardigan she had worn to Frank's funeral, because she owned nothing else that felt appropriate, waiting patiently to hear what her husband had left behind for the woman who had raised his sons from the ages of 7 and 4 and never once been asked to. The house on Chestnut Street, the house Maggie had scrubbed and painted and paid taxes on for 39 years, went entirely to Denny and Kurt jointly, along with the joint checking account, the savings account, and full ownership of Dolan's Hardware, the very store Maggie had kept the books for without a single paycheck across 35 years of her own life. Walter Briggs read each line in that same careful, colorless voice, and with every sentence, Maggie felt something in her chest quietly fold inward, not from the shock of sudden poverty, which she could have borne, but from the shock of erasure, as though 4 decades of Sunday suppers and packed school lunches and midnight fevers had simply never been entered into any ledger anyone in that room considered official. She kept waiting for someone to correct the record, to mention the store's handwritten ledgers in her own hand, the 35 years of 6 o'clock mornings, and no one did. When the attorney finally reached her name near the very bottom of the page, the room went noticeably still, and even Denny looked up from his phone screen for the first time all morning, as if mildly curious what scraps remained to be assigned. Denny slid a single crumpled dollar bill across the polished conference table, not gently, letting it skid until it came to rest directly against Maggie's folded hands. "Keep it," he said, his voice light, almost cheerful. "Buy yourself something nice, Maggie." Kurt let out a short laugh through his nose and added, "Dad always said you'd land on your feet," and neither of them looked at her long enough to actually see what landed in her eyes instead, which was not tears, not yet, but a disbelief so total and so complete, it settled over her like a strange and terrible calm. Walter Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his chair and said nothing at all, the way men in expensive suits so often say nothing when a cruelty is happening politely, right in front of them. Walter Briggs cleared his throat awkwardly and produced a small manila envelope, the very last item on his list, containing one rusted iron key with no label, no tag, and no written explanation attached to it anywhere in the entire file. "Frank left this for you specifically, Maggie," the attorney said, adjusting his glasses, "though I confess I don't personally know what it opens or why it matters. It arrived sealed," he added, "with instructions only to give it to you and no one else, whatever happens." Denny snorted at that and muttered something about his father's junk drawer finally getting properly cleaned out after all these years, and Kurt was already checking flight prices on his phone for a vacation he clearly intended to fund with money that, until 3 weeks earlier, had been just as much hers as theirs. Neither of them so much as glanced at the key twice. That same evening, packing cardboard boxes alone in the kitchen, where she had cooked roughly 10,000 meals across 4 decades, Maggie overheard Denny and Kurt talking quietly in the hallway just outside the door, their voices low, but nowhere near low enough. "She won't last a year on her own," Kurt was saying. "Let her rot in some rental with her Social Security check. It's not our problem anymore. It never really was." Denny laughed under his breath and agreed completely, adding that their father had been far too soft on her for far too long, and it was about time somebody in this family balanced the books properly, once and for all. "She was never really family anyway," Kurt added quietly. "Just Dad's help who stuck around long enough to get comfortable." Maggie stood frozen behind the pantry door, a stack of folded dish towels pressed against her chest, listening to 2 grown men she had personally raised from childhood, whose fevers she had nursed and whose lunches she had packed for 13 straight years, discuss her entire future like an unwanted line item finally being closed out for good. The humiliation did not stop with words alone. Within a single week, a locksmith arrived unannounced to rekey the front door of the house Maggie had lived in for 39 consecutive years, while her packed boxes still sat waiting out on the porch in a cold, steady rain, because Denny had told her, almost cheerfully, that the moving truck simply wasn't coming until the following Tuesday. The locksmith, a young man who clearly had no idea whose home this had been, apologized twice and offered to help her carry a box, an act of small kindness that nearly undid her more than any cruelty had. Neighbors watched silently from behind their curtains, saying absolutely nothing, the particular way small towns often do when they sense a cruelty far too large and too private for any of them to interrupt. Maggie stood on her own front steps, holding a borrowed umbrella over boxes labeled kitchen and photos and Frank's things, watching a brand new key turn smoothly in a lock that used to open for her without a single moment's thought for 39 straight years. Grief alone was one thing, something she had braced herself for since the funeral, something she understood the shape of and could carry quietly. Watching her own front door lock her out entirely was another thing altogether, and it was in that exact moment, standing soaked in the rain with nowhere yet to go, that Maggie finally let herself name the feeling crawling through her chest with total honesty. Humiliation, not simple sadness, not ordinary loss, but a hot, specific, deeply personal humiliation, the particular kind that only comes from being discarded in broad daylight by people who once called your own house theirs too, people whose small hands she had once held crossing that very same street on the way to school. The following Monday, at the very bank branch where she had done her banking for 3 full decades, a young teller informed Maggie, visibly uncomfortable and unable to quite meet her eyes, that the joint account had been frozen and then completely emptied 2 days after the funeral, all $42,000 of it, transferred out under an authorization Walter Briggs would later admit, red-faced, that he should have caught and questioned sooner. Maggie stood at the counter, turning the paperwork over in her hands, as though the numbers might rearrange themselves if she looked at them long enough. 2 women from her own church congregation stood in line directly behind her and overheard every word of the exchange, whispering to each other before the door had even closed, and by Wednesday morning, half of Saltmarsh Cove already knew that Frank Dolan's widow had been left with nothing more than a rusted key and a single crumpled dollar bill to her name, a rumor that traveled the pews faster than any hymn. Then came the boat. Frank's old fishing boat, the modest wooden one he had taken out most Saturday mornings for 30 straight years, the one Maggie had packed thermoses of coffee for every summer since 1985, sold within days to a stranger from 2 towns over for $1,100, a small fraction of what it was actually worth, sold simply to clear it off what Denny now casually referred to as his property in every conversation. Maggie learned about the sale secondhand, from a neighbor at the grocery store checkout line, not from either stepson directly, not even a text message to soften the blow, and something in her chest cracked open a little further at the thought of that particular boat, of all the things in the world Frank had loved, disappearing without so much as a courtesy phone call to the woman who had loved him longest and loved him best. Indignation began quietly replacing some of the disbelief by the second full week, rising in her chest the way heat rises before a storm finally breaks. Grief had always been patient and quiet in Maggie, but indignation, she was discovering for the first time in her 66 years, had teeth of its own, and she found herself allowing real anger to sit openly in her chest instead of swallowing it whole behind a tired smile and a fresh pot of coffee the way she always had before, for 4 decades running. She thought of every unpaid hour spent behind that hardware counter, every dinner plate filled before her own, every childhood fever nursed at 2 in the morning with a cool cloth and a hymn, and she thought, for the very first time in her entire adult life, that patience alone had never once been enough to keep a woman truly safe from people who had already decided what she was worth long before she ever had a say in the matter. 41 years of steady devotion, she realized, had bought her exactly $1 and a rusted key, and something about that arithmetic finally lit a fire in her that grief alone never could. On the day Maggie finally left Chestnut Street for good, Denny handed her a small paper bag containing exactly $1 bill and the same rusted key from the will reading, calling it, without a single flicker of shame on his face, her full and complete inheritance, properly witnessed and notarized, so there could be no dispute about it later on. He even asked her to sign for it, as though a receipt might make the moment feel less like theft and more like business. Kurt did not even bother coming outside to say goodbye, watching instead from an upstairs window with his arms crossed, already discussing renovation plans with a contractor over speakerphone as her taxi pulled slowly away down the street she had called home for 39 years. Maggie stood at the end of that long driveway one final time with a single suitcase, $1 bill folded in her coat pocket, and a key rusted almost completely solid, and she made herself a quiet, private promise standing there in the cold, steady rain that showed no sign of letting up any time soon. She had nothing left in this world to lose now, nothing they had not already taken from her one piece at a time, not the house, not the account, not even the boat, not even her own name spoken with any warmth. And if that key opened nothing at all, absolutely nothing, she told herself firmly, standing soaked to the bone at 66 years old with a suitcase in her hand, that she would still go and see with her own eyes exactly what her husband of 41 years had wanted her, of all people left in this world, to find. Maggie took the 6 o'clock bus out of Saltmarsh Cove the next morning, a battered suitcase on her lap and the rusted key wrapped carefully in a handkerchief inside her coat pocket, riding 40 minutes down the same coastal road Frank had driven alone every single Tuesday for 30 years, without ever once explaining why. She watched the pine trees give way to salt marsh, then to the gray glint of open water through a window streaked with old rain, and somewhere around the 3rd mile marker she made herself a private promise, whispered under her breath like a psalm her mother had taught her, that whatever waited at the end of this road, She would survive it the way she had survived everything else in her 66 years, quietly and entirely on her own 2 feet. She had $1 in her pocket, a single suitcase at her side, and nothing left to protect, which felt, strangely, like a kind of freedom she had not known in decades. For the first time since the funeral, she noticed the ordinary things again: the smell of diesel through the bus vents, the hum of tires on wet asphalt, and she let herself wonder, quietly, what Frank had seen out this same window every single Tuesday for 30 years. The bus let her off at the edge of Saltmarsh Harbor, a working fishing town of cracked sidewalks, faded storefronts, and gulls circling low over the wharf. And there, at the very end of the pier, where the paved road finally gave up and gravel took over, stood the Cannery. It was nothing at all like the town's whispers had prepared her for. Weather-beaten, yes, streaked with rust down every seam of its corrugated siding, salt-bleached and boarded at the upper windows, but far larger than she had pictured, and far sturdier underneath the neglect, its brick foundation solid and square beneath 4 decades of storms, its padlocked steel door sitting untouched on a building the county apparently considered nothing more than an eyesore, not worth the cost of tearing down. She stood at the gravel edge for a long moment, suitcase in hand, simply staring up at it, unable to reconcile the town's careless word for the place, eyesore, with the sheer scale of what stood in front of her. Somewhere behind that door, she thought, was whatever Frank had spent 30 Tuesdays a year protecting, and she found she was no longer afraid to find out what it was. A dockhand mending nets nearby looked up as she approached, squinting first at her face, and then, much longer, at the rusted key clutched tight in her hand. "You're Frank Dolan's wife, aren't you?" he said slowly, setting his net down entirely and getting to his feet like the moment demanded it. "You don't know," he added, shaking his head with something like disbelief of his own. "You really don't know what this place is, or what it's worth, do you, ma'am?" And Maggie shook her head slowly, unsure what there was left to know. Before Maggie could ask him what on earth he meant by that, a woman's voice called out from behind her, warm and immediate, cutting clean through the wind off the water. "Maggie Dolan, at last," the voice said. "I have been waiting 3 long months for you to find your way down here, wondering some weeks if you ever would." The dockhand quietly picked his net back up, glancing once more at Maggie with an expression she could not quite place, somewhere between pity and awe. Maggie turned to find a trim, silver-haired woman in her 60s crossing the gravel lot with the brisk, purposeful walk of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment in her head for years. "I'm Ruth Callahan, notary public, and an old friend of your husband's," the woman said, extending a steady hand and holding Maggie's gaze. "The way an old friend does. Frank asked me to wait for this day, whenever it finally came, and I confess, I wondered some Tuesdays if it ever would." Maggie's fingers tightened around the rusted key as Ruth walked her toward the padlocked door and nodded toward it, her eyes bright with something caught between grief and quiet anticipation. "Go on," Ruth said gently, resting one hand lightly on Maggie's shoulder. "It's time now, Maggie. It's finally time." And Maggie lifted the key toward the lock with a hand that would not quite stop trembling in the wind. Somewhere behind that rusted steel door, 30 years of Tuesdays were waiting to finally explain themselves. The rusted key turned with a groan of metal that had not moved in decades, protesting every inch of the way, and the padlock finally gave way, dropping open in Maggie's palm like something exhaling after a very long-held breath. Ruth Callahan pushed the heavy steel door inward, and the 2 women stepped together into a cavernous space that smelled of brine, cold iron, and 40 years of undisturbed stillness. Sunlight cut through gaps in the boarded windows, in long, dusty shafts, falling across rows of empty steel tanks and conveyor lines that had once packed thousands of cans of herring a day before the cannery closed its doors for good in 1988. It was not a ruin, Maggie realized slowly, turning in a full, careful circle in the middle of the vast concrete floor. It was a building someone had deliberately preserved, swept, and sealed away from the rest of the world, waiting patiently for exactly this moment to arrive, the way a promise waits quietly to be kept, no matter how many years it takes. Dust hung suspended in the shafts of light, like something holy, and for the first time in 3 long weeks, Maggie forgot, entirely and completely, to feel afraid, or humiliated, or discarded. She only felt, standing there in the cold and the salt air, strangely and unexpectedly close to Frank again, as though he had simply stepped out of the room a moment before she arrived. Ruth Callahan closed the heavy door gently behind them and turned to face Maggie directly, her expression suddenly serious in a way it had not been out on the windy gravel lot. "You need to understand something important before we go any further into this building," Ruth said, taking both of Maggie's cold hands firmly in her own warm ones. Frank did not simply own this cannery the way a man owns a spare piece of land he forgot about. He bought it in complete secret, entirely on purpose, and everything inside these walls belongs to you, and to you alone, legally, completely, whether Denny and Kurt ever choose to accept that fact or not. I witnessed the original paperwork myself 38 years ago, sitting right at Frank's kitchen table with a notary seal in my handbag and a pot of coffee going cold between us, Ruth continued, her voice thick with the weight of decades. I have been waiting every single day since Frank's funeral for you to finally walk through that door so I could tell you the truth he asked me to carry quietly for him, a truth I have guarded the way he asked me to, without ever breathing a word of it to another living soul in this county, not even my own husband. Near the entrance, bolted directly to a support beam where no casual visitor would ever think to look twice, hung a small brass frame protecting a single yellow document behind cloudy glass. Maggie stepped closer, squinting in the dim, dusty light, and made out a date stamped at the very top, October of 1988, the same autumn she had been pregnant and lost the baby, the same autumn Frank had gone strangely quiet for weeks, without explanation. Beneath the date sat a formal purchase agreement bearing Frank's own steady signature and a sale price of exactly $40,000 for the entire waterfront parcel and the crumbling structure standing on it, money she now realized must have come from the small inheritance his own mother had left him that same year. That was the very same year the cannery finally went bankrupt, Ruth explained quietly, standing close beside her at the frame. Everyone in this town simply assumed the county would eventually tear the building down, or let the tide finish the job for them over time, the way the sea eventually claims anything left too long unattended. Nobody wanted swampy waterfront land attached to a dead herring factory back then, not with the whole New England fishing industry collapsing the way it was that decade, boats sitting idle at every dock from here to Portland. "Frank saw something none of the rest of us ever saw," Ruth said softly. "Or maybe he simply saw you, Maggie, standing here one day in his place, years down the road, and decided right then and there this land was going to belong to you, no matter what happened to him first." Maggie stood very still, one hand pressed flat against the cold brass frame, feeling the very first real crack of understanding spread slowly through everything she thought she had known about her quiet, steady, unremarkable husband of 41 years, a man she now realized she had never fully known at all. Ruth led her deeper into the building, past rusted conveyor belts and stacked wooden crates gone soft and gray with age, toward a small back office where a floor safe sat, bolted directly into the poured concrete, its exterior dulled by decades of salt air. But its lock mechanism, Ruth pointed out immediately, clearly oiled and maintained far more recently than anything else in this entire abandoned building. "Frank came down here more often than even I fully knew about," Ruth admitted quietly, crouching beside the heavy steel door of the safe with her knees cracking audibly on the cold concrete floor. He tended this thing like a man tending a garden. Nobody else in the world was ever allowed to see or even know existed, oiling the hinges every spring, sweeping the floor by hand, checking the roofline after every storm that rolled in off the Atlantic, quietly and faithfully, for 30 straight years, without a single soul the wiser except for me and, I suspect, his own conscience. He used to joke that this place kept him honest, Ruth added, though I never once understood what he meant by it until just now, watching your face. Ruth produced a small folded slip of paper from her handbag, a combination Frank had mailed to her 3 years earlier from a post office 2 counties away, so no local clerk would ever recognize the return address, sealed inside a second envelope with strict instructions never to open it until this exact day finally arrived. Whenever that day came, however many years it took. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the dial through 3 careful numbers Frank had chosen with obvious tenderness. Maggie's own birthday folded quietly into the sequence, the way a man folds a love letter into the smallest possible shape, and the heavy safe door swung open at last with a soft mechanical click that somehow sounded impossibly loud inside the empty, echoing cannery, loud enough that both women went briefly silent, listening to it fade. Inside the safe sat a fireproof document box, and resting squarely on top of it, sealed shut with a small drop of red wax, an envelope with Maggie's full name written across the front in Frank's own unmistakable handwriting, the very same steady hand that had signed 39 years of birthday cards and grocery lists and school permission slips for 2 boys who never once thanked her for any of it. Maggie's fingers shook badly as she lifted the envelope free from the box, the wax seal cracking softly under her thumb, and Ruth stepped back several respectful paces toward the window, giving her the small mercy of privacy for whatever came next, inside those words her husband had left behind. "My Maggie," the letter began, "if you are finally reading this, then I am gone, and Denny and Kurt have almost certainly already shown you exactly who they truly are underneath all those years of holiday smiles and borrowed money. I bought this cannery in complete secret because I could not risk Denny's gambling debts eventually swallowing it whole before it ever reached your hands safely, and because I could not fully trust either of my own sons to protect something built entirely for you instead of for themselves, the way they have never once protected anything in their lives that wasn't theirs to spend first. Every single Tuesday, for 30 years running, I drove down here alone, not because I loved you any less back home at our kitchen table, but because I loved you enough to build something quietly that no one on this earth could ever take away from you, one signature and one deed and one patient year at a time, long before I ever knew how badly you would someday need it, or how little those boys would leave you with. I placed this cannery and every inch of land beneath it into a private holding company the very same month I bought it." The letter continued in Frank's careful hand, "with you named as the sole beneficiary from the first document onward, long before either of the boys were even old enough to understand what an inheritance meant, or what it would someday be worth to a man willing to gamble it away. Ruth Callahan has held the second key to this whole arrangement since 1988, and she will walk you through every remaining paper and every clause, exactly as the 2 of us planned it together, all those years ago, at her own kitchen table over cold coffee that neither of us ever remembered to reheat while we worked. Trust her the way you have always trusted me." The letter closed, "because she has earned it in ways I never had the courage to explain to you while I was still alive to say it myself, and because a woman needs at least one person left standing beside her who already knows the whole truth." Ruth stepped forward again once Maggie had finally finished reading, wiping at her own eyes without any embarrassment at all, and lifted the notarized deed carefully from the fireproof box, laying it flat across a dusty workbench so Maggie could see her own name printed clearly and permanently at the very top of the page in bold, official type. The ink barely faded after 38 years in that dry, sealed box. Margaret Ann Dolan, sole owner, Anchor Point Holdings LLC, a private company formed in the autumn of 1988 for the single, express purpose of shielding this exact property from any future claim by anyone in this world other than Maggie herself. No matter what happened to Frank, no matter how many years passed in between, no matter who came looking for it, later expecting a different answer. That deed alone would have been an enormous discovery on its own, more than enough to leave Maggie breathless standing in that dusty office. But it was the thin folder resting just beneath it that made Ruth's voice finally catch in her throat entirely. Inside sat a recent letter from a marina development firm 2 states away, dated only 4 months before Frank's death, responding to a discreet, private inquiry Frank had quietly filed on his own, listing a formal professional appraisal for the entire 3.8-acre waterfront parcel and the cannery structure standing on it. $12 million, the letter stated plainly in black ink, driven by New Luxury Marina. Zoning the county board had recently and quietly approved for that exact stretch of protected harbor frontage, zoning most residents of Saltmarsh Cove did not even know existed yet. $12 million, Ruth repeated slowly, letting each word settle on its own, watching the number land visibly on Maggie's face, like a wave finally breaking after building quietly out at sea for 30 full years without anyone on shore ever noticing it gathering strength beneath the surface. Frank knew this land was about to become the single most valuable stretch of waterfront in the entire county, and instead of selling it, instead of telling a single living soul, instead of cashing out and buying himself an easier, more comfortable life somewhere warmer, he simply waited and protected it, and trusted that one day his Maggie would walk through that exact door and understand, all at once, exactly how much he had loved her in total silence for 3 decades, without ever once needing her to know the true size of it while he was still alive to watch her face change. But the folder held one final document, tucked carefully beneath the appraisal, folded twice and slightly yellowed at the edges, a clause Frank and his own attorney had quietly drafted years earlier and filed directly alongside the LLC paperwork, specifying plainly that any attempt by his sons to claim, encumber, or interfere with property legally belonging to Maggie Dolan would automatically trigger a full accounting and clawback of any Dolan estate assets those same sons had already taken for themselves, reaching all the way back to the house on Chestnut Street, the joint accounts, and the store on Main Street. Frank built himself a trap door, Ruth said quietly, folding the document closed, and Denny and Kurt have already been standing directly on top of it for weeks now, without ever once knowing it was even there beneath their feet. Outside, unseen by either woman standing in that dusty office, a familiar truck was already crossing the county line towards Saltmarsh Harbor at that very moment, engine straining on the coastal grade, because a bank teller's whispered rumor had finally reached Denny's ears that same morning over a cup of gas station coffee, a rumor about some old cannery and a name on a deed that made absolutely no sense to him at all yet. Something cold and unfamiliar had settled low in his gut, a feeling he did not have a name for and did not like one bit, telling him he needed to see this place for himself, and soon, before whatever Maggie had apparently found down here slipped any further out of his control than it already had. Denny's truck skidded onto the gravel lot outside the cannery just as the afternoon light was starting to fade, kicking up dust and loose stones against the old brick wall, Kurt's car pulling in hard right behind him, tires crunching to a stop only a foot from the water's edge. Both men were already out of their vehicles and moving toward the padlocked door before the engines had even fully stopped ticking over in the cold evening air. "What the hell is this place?" Denny shouted across the lot, voice sharp with something that was not quite anger yet, and not quite fear either. something closer to panic dressed up as outrage. "Why does a bank teller know your name is on the deed to some old cannery worth more than our whole house put together?" he demanded. "And where exactly has this thing even been hiding all these years, while we buried our own father?" Ruth Callahan stepped out to meet them on the gravel, calm and entirely unhurried, with a folder tucked firmly under one arm, and Walter Briggs walking briskly behind her, straightening his jacket as he came. The family attorney had been summoned by a single phone call the moment Ruth had spotted Denny's truck coming down the coastal road 20 minutes earlier, and he had driven the whole way with his hazard lights on. "This is Anchor Point Holdings," Ruth said evenly, meeting Denny's eyes without blinking once. "It has belonged to your stepmother, free and clear, since October of 1988. Long before either of you were even old enough to spend a dollar you hadn't earned yet," she added, "and it is not going to change hands today, or tomorrow, or any single day after this one, no matter how this conversation goes." Denny's face went through 3 colors in the span of 5 seconds, red, then white, then a strange gray Maggie had never once seen on him before, not even at his own father's funeral 3 weeks earlier. "That's not possible," he said, his voice cracking down the middle, like something finally breaking under pressure. "Dad never mentioned any cannery," he insisted, "not once, not ever, to anybody in this whole family, and he wouldn't have hidden something this big from us, not from his own sons." Maggie only watched him say it, saying nothing at all in return, letting the silence answer for her instead. Walter Briggs opened his own copy of the file calmly and read the clause aloud, plain and unhurried, the trapdoor clause Frank had drafted years earlier with his own quiet, deliberate hands at a kitchen table 2 counties away. Any attempt by either of Frank Dolan's sons to claim, encumber, or interfere with property belonging to Margaret Dolan, the attorney read, his voice carrying flat and clear across the gravel lot and out over the water, triggers an immediate and full clawback of estate assets already transferred to those same sons, retroactive to the exact date of Frank's death 3 weeks earlier. He looked up once, briefly, over the rim of his glasses, to make certain both men understood every single word of what he had just read aloud. "That means the house on Chestnut Street," Walter said, looking up from the page directly at Denny and Kurt, in turn, one at a time, letting the silence stretch a moment longer than it needed to. "That means the account you emptied within 48 hours of the funeral, every last cent of it. That means the boat you sold off for $1,100 to a stranger from 2 towns over, sold behind Maggie's back. Every dollar and every asset comes back to the estate, effective immediately," he said, "and from there it transfers directly into Margaret Dolan's name, exactly as Frank arranged it decades ago, long before either of you ever thought to test him, or the quiet paperwork he left waiting behind him." Kurt's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out at all. "You can't do that," he finally managed. "That's our inheritance. We're his sons. We have rights here. This isn't legal." Ruth's voice stayed level and unshaken, cutting clean through the wind coming off the harbor without ever once rising in volume. "You were his sons," she said, "and he loved you both, more than either of you ever gave him credit for in return. But he was not blind," Ruth continued, "and he built this the year you first started lying to him about money, Denny, and he built it stronger every single year after that, quietly, patiently, the exact way he did everything else in his life." Denny lunged half a step toward the folder in Walter's hands, and Ruth stepped calmly between them without so much as flinching, her voice dropping low and entirely final in a way that stopped him cold. "This has already been filed with the county clerk's office," she said, "this morning, before either of you even climbed into your trucks to come find us out here. There is nothing left here for either of you to threaten or to take or to argue your way back into, no matter how loudly you raise your voice on this gravel lot this afternoon." Maggie stood a few feet away through all of it, watching two grown men she had raised from the ages of 7 and 4 finally understand, in real time, exactly what a rusted key and one crumpled dollar bill had actually been worth all along. She did not raise her voice once, not a single time. She did not need to. "Keep the dollar, Denny," she said quietly, her tone almost gentle, almost kind. "You earned it, fair and square, and it is the very last thing of mine you will ever hold in your hand again as long as you live." Denny sank down slowly onto the tailgate of his own truck, head in his hands, elbows on his knees, all the fight suddenly gone out of him at once, while Kurt simply turned and walked several paces toward the water, staring out at the harbor as if the tide itself might explain how any of this had happened without his knowledge or his permission. Neither man said another word for a long, heavy minute. The gulls overhead, the only sound left on that gravel lot, besides the water lapping quietly against the pilings below. The humiliation that had once belonged entirely to Maggie now sat squarely on the two of them instead, right there on that gravel lot, in front of Ruth, in front of the family attorney, in front of the whole quiet harbor town that would hear every detail of it by morning, over coffee at the diner on Main Street. Maggie turned away from both stepsons at last, walking back toward the cannery door beside Ruth without a single backward glance, leaving Denny and Kurt exactly where they had left her 3 weeks earlier on that rainy porch, with nothing and no one left in the world to blame but themselves and the choices they had made. What came next for her, she had not yet decided, but for the first time in 41 years, that decision, whatever it turned out to be, was entirely and completely her own to make. 6 months later, the Salt Marsh Cannery stood freshly painted along its harbor face, rust scrubbed away and replaced with clean white siding, a new sign hanging above the entrance in simple hand-lettered white paint, Dolan and Callahan Fisheries, a small working seafood operation Maggie had built from the ground up with Ruth's steady help and a crew of 11 local dock workers who had spent years struggling to find steady wages anywhere else in the county. Maggie herself now walked those same concrete floors every single morning at 7 o'clock sharp, coffee in hand, wearing a new green apron with her own name stitched proudly across the chest for the very first time in her 66 years on this earth. The gulls still circled overhead exactly as they always had, but the building beneath them no longer sat silent and waiting, and neither, anymore, did she. Neighbors who once watched silently from behind their curtains now stopped by on Saturdays just to see what she had built, some of them a little sheepish about the way they had once looked away. She used the reclaimed estate carefully and without a trace of excess, paying off the last of Frank's medical bills first, restoring the roofline exactly the way Frank himself had always kept it, storm after storm, and setting aside a modest trust that would let her live comfortably, quietly, and entirely on her own terms for whatever years remained ahead of her. She needed nothing further at all from Denny or Kurt, not their apologies, not their attention, not even their names spoken aloud in her presence anymore. Though Walter Briggs mentioned once that Denny had finally found steady work at a marina 2 towns over and seemed, by all accounts, a little humbled by the whole affair. For the first time since 1985, she found she slept easily and fully through the night, undisturbed by unanswered questions or unfinished ledgers waiting somewhere in the dark corners of that old house she no longer called home, or missed the way she once thought she would. She spent that fall, and then that long winter, and then that first tender spring rebuilding not just the cannery walls, but her own days, one steady hour at a time, exactly the way Frank had rebuilt this place quietly for her across 30 patient years, without ever once asking for a shred of credit. She learned, slowly and deliberately, to sit at her own table and eat first, for once in her life, rather than last, a small and stubborn habit that took her the better part of 3 full months to unlearn after 4 decades of quiet, automatic sacrifice at every single meal she had ever served in that old kitchen. Some habits, she discovered, took longer to undo than others, and she gave herself permission, finally and without guilt, to be patient with herself the same way she had always been patient with everyone else around her for 4 straight decades. She spent her own Tuesdays now the way Frank once quietly had, driving that same familiar coastal road alone in her own car, though these Tuesdays she drove toward something rather than away from it, toward purpose instead of secrecy. She drove toward a business that carried both their names on the sign, toward a harbor town that had come to know her not as Frank Dolan's overlooked and forgotten widow, but as Margaret Dolan, owner, employer, and the woman who had rebuilt an entire waterfront property out of nothing more than a rusted key and 1 crumpled dollar bill. Ruth still met her there most Tuesdays too, the two of them sharing coffee at the very same battered workbench where the fireproof safe had once creaked open 6 months earlier, trading stories about Frank that neither of them ever seemed to tire of telling. She had spent 4 decades being exactly who everyone else needed her to be, patient, silent, endlessly giving, filling every plate before her own without ever once complaining out loud. And now, finally, at long last, she was free to discover who she had always been underneath all of it, all along. She was a woman capable of running a company, rebuilding a harbor, and rewriting, at 66 years old, every quiet assumption anyone in that family had ever made about her worth or her lack of it. Love had protected her even in silence. She had come to understand fully now, and patience, in the end, had outlasted every last ounce of greed ever arrayed against her across that conference table 3 weeks after the funeral. One quiet Tuesday evening in early spring, cleaning out the very last untouched drawer of Frank's old back office at the Cannery, the same office where Ruth had once opened that first safe 6 months earlier, Maggie found a second sealed envelope tucked carefully behind a loose board she had never once noticed before in 6 full months of steady work in that very room. It was addressed in his familiar, careful handwriting to simply, "My Maggie, one more thing," and her hands went still around it before she had even broken the seal, her heart already beginning to race the exact way it had that very first day at the Cannery door with Ruth standing beside her. If you have stayed with Maggie faithfully all the way to this final quiet moment, standing beside her in that dusty back office with a second sealed envelope trembling in her hands, thank you, genuinely and completely, for walking every single step of this journey alongside her from that rainy driveway to this quiet spring evening. You watched a woman handed $1 and a rusted key by the very people who owed her everything they had, everything they inherited, everything they were ever given by a father who trusted them far more than they deserved. And you watched that same woman rise, quietly and without a single ounce of vengeance in her heart, into something far larger and far stronger than anyone in her family ever once believed she could become, even at 66 years old, even after 41 years of being overlooked at her own kitchen table. Her story carries one simple, unshakable truth worth carrying with you long after this video ends and the screen goes dark tonight. Patience is never wasted, no matter how many years or how many decades it asks you to wait quietly in the background of your own life. Quiet devotion is never truly invisible, even when the people closest to you insist, again and again, year after year, on treating it that way at every Sunday supper. And love, real love, the kind Frank Dolan carried for his Maggie across 30 Silent Tuesday, drives down that coastal road, protects the people we cherish, even when we cannot find the words to say it directly to their face while we are still alive and standing right beside them. If this story stirred something in you, something familiar, something quietly personal, we would love to hear about it in the comments below this video, however you choose to say it. Tell us, in just one single word, exactly how you would have felt standing in Maggie's place, holding that rusted key in the rain with nothing left in the world but a single dollar bill to your name and a lifetime of devotion behind you that no one else ever seemed to notice. Your one word helps us know this story truly reached you where it mattered most, and it helps other viewers who need to hear it find their own way here too. One comment and one quiet moment of recognition at a time. If you know someone who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly dismissed by people who owed them so much more than they ever gave back in return, share this story with them today, right now, before you close this tab and move on to whatever comes next. Sometimes the people who need most to hear that patience outlasts greed are the very people who feel most invisible in their own family, in their own home, at their own kitchen table, filling every plate but their own, without a word of complaint, decade after decade after decade. And if you are new here, welcome. We are so genuinely glad you found your way to us today, however you happen to arrive. We tell stories exactly like Maggie's every single week, stories of quiet devotion finally being seen, of patience finally being rewarded after years and sometimes decades of waiting, of ordinary people discovering extraordinary strength inside themselves right when they least expect it. Subscribe and join us again next time, because remember, always and without exception, that quiet devotion is never the end of the story. It is only the key waiting patiently, faithfully, in the dark, for the right hand to finally come along, all these years later, and turn it.